everyone. Welcome to the second session of this series that we are doing with Ashish. Um, Ashish is a photographer, doing photography since a long time, and he conducts sessions on photography. Um, and yesterday we covered the first part of this session, this series, wherein Ashish told uh, what one should think about or do even before clicking or taking the first picture, how to start. Today, he will tell us the basics of photography in terms of the exposure triangle. These are the three main components in starting your photography journey. Understanding these three components is the focus when you switch from automated mode to manual mode. I mean, you get your phone camera, you just start clicking, and many times I come across people who don't even know that there is a manual mode in their phone camera. So, for all people who want to learn about manual mode and how to utilize it, this is the session. Ashish, over to you.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Pankaj, for such a nice descriptive introduction to me and to the session that we are going to do today. Without much ado, I'll get right into the content because it's a short and sweet 30-minute session. So what we'll be looking at today is exposure triangle, and we will try to see how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed interact with each other, how do they function, and how do we control to achieve a perfect exposure in our images. So as we begin, let me just first talk about what exposure is. What does exposure mean? So exposure, just like the English word, it means to expose something to something else. It means to expose. And in photography, what do we expose? We expose the sensor of the camera to whatever scenery or object lies in front of the camera. So we expose it for a certain time with certain characteristics to record the image, and the camera sensor records the image. So that is one image is called one exposure. So that is in a nutshell the understanding about exposure. Your camera basically records light as we expose the sensor to the scene in front of it. It records the light. That's how it makes the image. And photography as a term itself means writing with light, photography. Photo means light and graphy means to write. So that's what your camera does, it records the light. And now our purpose with these three things, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, is to control that the right amount of light is recorded by the camera sensor. So that's what we are trying to achieve in manual settings. And if we talk about the auto settings, your camera has a processor, it has a computer, and that tries to compute what will be the right values of these three parameters, and it tries to guess those three values. It doesn't have the human judgment to see if the picture is bright or if the picture is dark, but it does the mathematical computations to figure out what might be a good value of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. But you know, like if as a photographer your camera is more smarter than you, then what's the point of you being the photographer? It's the camera that's doing its job. So as we get into the manual settings, you take a control in your hands because it gives you a flexibility to control creativity, to express your creativity in your pictures. It gives you that flexibility, and that's why if you are thinking to seriously get into photography, manual mode is something that you need to be exploring and on daily basis. As much as you click on manual mode, you will learn how these three parameters interact with each other. And we'll look into it as we go further in the session. Now, some of you may be aware about histograms, some of you may not, and if you know it already, then it's really good, but if you don't, then don't worry about it. I will try to simplify as I explain. An image is made up of tones, and tones are basically values of illumination, which means it's like if you're a painter, you take a brush and you put black paint on it, and then you paint a little bit. Then you take white color and then you paint a little bit, and then you keep mixing between these black and white to get the right tone at different places in your canvas if you're a painter. In photography, camera try to do the same thing, and it judges like how much an object is dark or slightly lighter or completely white or it's gray. So the camera tries to judge the tones that are there in the picture. And based on the lighting in the environment and based on the ability of the camera sensor, it has a resolution. It's not the megapixel resolution, it's a resolution to identify different tones. Because let's say there's two colors, two tones, one is white and another is slightly less white than the other one. And there's a pattern formed between these two tones. Your camera may or may not be able to capture the distinction between these two very closely placed tones. And that's where the tonal resolution comes into play. Now, these lighter tones are called highlights, and the darker tones are called shadows. And why we are talking about these tones? Because exposure means you expose the camera sensor to the light. Now, if it gets overexposed, which means too much light comes into it, then all the lighter tones, the details get washed out, because there's too much light. So the white and this little bit less white all becomes the same. And the details in that part of the spectrum, that part of the image are lost. The same thing happens if not enough light is able to enter into the camera. Then what happens? There's not enough light. The whole scene looks dark, and the details in the shadow, which means the black and little bit less black and little bit less black, so that area of the image gets completely black. So the details in those tones are lost. And then the picture is called underexposed in these kind of circumstances. So now, as we get into the manual mode, what we are trying to do, we're trying to expose the image correctly. It should neither be underexposed nor be overexposed. And what it will mean in the terms of picture will have the darkest dark, darkest black, and the whitest white. And all the tones in between, and all those tones will be distinguishable. That's the ideal condition. It doesn't happen because there are limitation of the equipment, so it doesn't usually happen. But that is the purpose of trying to expose an image correctly to get as much range of these tones as possible. So far, I hope it's not too complicated and too technical. I'm trying to simplify it as much as possible.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so let's, now you have some understanding about what exposure is and what does overexposed image mean, what does underexposed image mean. I'll quickly summarize. The overexposed means when there's too much light, an image kind of looks whitewashed. It's like too much white and lighter tones in the image. And the details in the lighter tones is lost. It's kind of like when you take an image of outside and the details in the clouds and the sky, it looks completely white. So the cloud details are kind of washed out, and any white object in the, or lighter tone object in the image is washed out. That is called overexposed. And the same thing if there's a low light, or you take an indoor picture and then the details in the hair is lost. So if somebody's hair look completely black, there's no details in the hair. That means the image is underexposed. The black and darker tones are kind of lost. So this is what we talked about, and now we will get into the first of these three parameters that we are talking today. I will start with ISO. There's no reason to start first with ISO, but it just happens to, we have to start with one, so I chose ISO to start with first.
Everyone, you can hold on your questions. I see questions coming in. You can hold on your questions till session end, then we'll have a Q&A round. So there you can put up your questions once the session is complete. Yeah, please go ahead, Ashish.
Yeah, thank you, Pankaj. So ISO is, many people will try to think what is the full form of ISO, what does it stand? It just stands for International Standard Organization, because they are into the business of standardizing things for the rest of the world. And there's a history about it, and I won't get into it. If you want to read about what why ISO is called ISO, you may look into it on the internet. I will not get into it. I'll get into the practical application, what it is and how does it affect your pictures. So ISO basically represents the sensitivity of your camera sensor. If you increase the ISO, it's increasing the sensitivity of your sensor. If you decrease the ISO, it's reducing the sensitivity of your sensor. So this is basically what is happening. And I hope all of you know how to control these settings in your camera, because in your previous session, we asked everybody to read the camera manual. If you don't know, if you have not yet read the camera manual, you can read your camera manual. It will tell you how to control ISO settings in your camera, because brand to brand, it differs how you control these settings in your particular camera. So anyways, ISO, for now, just say ISO is a number that you can control either by dialing a dial, or just punch in this number, and that's ISO. That's the sensitivity of the sensor. And you can control it for picture-to-picture basis. For one picture, you can have a certain ISO value. For another picture, you can have another ISO value. And depending on the scene, you can change it. You have the flexibility. Now, why do we need to change the sensitivity of the sensor in the first place? It's very interesting. If you think about it, we have our purpose to control exposure, to get the right exposure, is to allow right amount of light onto the sensor.
Right.
Now let's just say the light in the surrounding is limited in scope. It's a limited amount of light available.
Right.
So what can you do to increase the amount of light? Well, you cannot increase the amount of light. What you can do, you can increase the sensitivity, the ability of sensor to see light more effectively,
Right.
to record light more effectively. And that's what basically ISO does. It amplifies the signal capturing strength of your sensor. So it's able to capture even low amount of light quite well. But then it has a flip side of ISO. You can increase the sensitivity of your camera, but that increases the grains in the image, that is noise. And if there's more noise, that means the clarity, the sharpness in the picture is affected. So that's something to remember. You can improve your ability to shoot in low light by increasing the ISO, but as you increase the ISO, there will be grains and noise in the picture, and it will affect the sharpness and details of the picture. With modern cameras, and as the technology is evolving, the ability to shoot at higher ISOs is increasing day by day. So with you must be noticing that Sony has launched their camera SR3, what is called? SR73, 7R3. 7R3, and now they have
AR3. AR3
A7R3.
A7R3.
It's A7R3 was their main camera, and now this year they have launched A7R4. And similarly, Nikon launched their D810, then they launched D850, and what's the other brand? Canon. They launched, they have 5D Mark III, then they launched 5D Mark IV. And one thing that you will see is common between these upgrades is the newer version is able to shoot at lower ISOs while giving you acceptable quality. So most camera companies will advertise that they can shoot up to 6,400 ISO, 12,800 ISO, even 1,28,000 ISO. But it doesn't mean the picture will be acceptable at that ISO. It will be really grainy. It will not be for any use at that point of time. But let's say if the previous version was able to shoot up to 3,200 ISO, then the newer model will be able to shoot up to 6,400 ISO with the perfectly acceptable images. So that's how the technology is growing, and this is really interesting to note. All right, so there is something that I will get back after covering the other two aspects to ISO, and Pankaj just remind me, there's something about artificial light to add to the ISO part. Let's move on to aperture. If you have any questions regarding ISO, please note it down and ask it at the end of the session. We have 15 minutes question and answer session, so you'll be able to ask that. Let's move on to aperture. Now, we have discussed like to be able to capture more light into the camera, we can increase the sensitivity of the camera, but it introduces noise if we do that too much.
Right.
The other way to control how much light enters into your camera is aperture. And what is aperture? Aperture is basically a window between the camera sensor and your lens. And I'll show you, I have a lens here. So this is a lens. This is the back side of the lens that goes in the camera. And you see this tiny hole? That's through that hole, the light comes onto the sensor. This is the side that faces the sensor. This is the side that faces the subject. So you can see that tiny small hole, that's the aperture basically. And there's a way to control it through the, and you see this opens like this. So this is a very low aperture and this is high aperture. So high aperture means it's wide open and more light can get in. Low aperture means it's very small opening and only small amount of light can come in. So that was a demonstration. I hope you liked it. So if you are in a situation, shooting situation where light is low, there's low lighting situation, then what will you do? You will open the aperture wide so that more light can come in. All right? On the other hand, if there's too much light, let's say broad daylight, you're outdoors and it's broad daylight, then what will you do? You will close down your aperture so that a smaller amount of light can come in, as there's too much light. So you want lesser amount of light to come into the camera. So that's how you operate the aperture. Now aperture has some side effects. Oh, before we get into the side effects of aperture, I would like to mention something. The aperture in camera system is represented by f numbers. F-stops or F numbers, and in your camera you are able to control this F number, and I'll just show you like quickly how does it look. So this is, I hope you can see.
So it's not very clear because of light.
It's not able to see.
It's too bright.
Okay, leave it. Anyway, you guys can figure out how to set aperture in your camera, because this session is not about settings of your camera. There's a next session and we'll prepare better for that. It's about understanding how these three parameters interact with each other and how do they control. So F number represents your aperture, and how does it, it's kind of inverse to your, it's counterintuitive. So if the F number is low, it means the aperture is wide.
Right.
Aperture is wide open. This means at a low F number, more light can get into the camera. Contrary, or if F number is very small, no, very big, that means the aperture opening is very small, and very smaller, lesser amount of light can get into the camera. So that is really important to understand and remember it, because it's counterintuitive, it sounds inverse. So that's why it's important to remember. The other thing is, aperture is the property of the lens. It's not the property of the camera. So you can have a lens that has higher aperture. The minimum aperture is quite high. Like if the lens has a minimum aperture f4, then it cannot have f numbers lower than that. So that means it cannot open aperture wider than that. And as you reduce the f number of a lens, it becomes more expensive and it becomes bigger in size. So that is something you need to remember. Most lenses, zoom lenses, expensive zoom lenses have f-stop 2.8 fixed, which is like aperture can go as wide open as 2.8, f2.8, and it stays same for different variable focal lengths. And cheaper zoom lenses have variable aperture, which means at some focal lengths it will be 3.5 or 2.8, and at other higher focal lengths it will be the minimum f-stop or aperture available will be 4 or 5, 5.6, like that. So that is something to know about lenses. So we'll cover this concept in more details when we come to lens and camera selection.
Right.
All right. So now I'll come to the side effect of aperture. This is very interesting, and many of you ask about bokeh. In fact, some gentlemen yesterday asked about bokeh.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is it. Bokeh is related to aperture, and we will see how. So aperture, we control light, amount of light that's entering into the camera through aperture. And this another thing, the side effect that happens as we change aperture is depth of field. Depth of field is linked with aperture. As you increase or decrease aperture, you will increase or decrease depth of field. Now I'll try to explain what depth of field is, and because it's a kind of complicated topic, if you're not able to understand, please go and search, find a YouTube tutorial or something, but to learn what depth of field is, because it's very important if you want to get into the manual settings. So there are two things that you need to understand before we understand depth of field. One is minimum focusing distance. Each lens for a particular focal length has a minimum focusing distance. So for example, I have this lens, and let's say it's mounted on a camera, and its minimum focusing distance is like 1 feet. So it cannot focus closer than 1 feet. All right. So no matter what you do, this lens cannot focus closer than 1 feet. So that's minimum focusing distance. The next thing is focal plane. Focal plane is like if you're holding a camera I'm sorry, I have a Nikon brand. I'm not endorsing Nikon brand. It's just the camera that I have.
That's right. That's right.
Just want to clarify. So this is your camera, and if I remove the lens, you can see the mirror inside, and just behind the mirror is the sensor. Now, in all the cameras, there's a symbol. I don't know if you can see, but this phi symbol.
Yeah, it is visible.
Yes. So all the cameras will have this phi symbol, and it represents the focal plane of the camera. So that phi, that line which goes like this, that is representing the focal plane of the camera. That's where your sensor is. So your sensor is in this plane, where this mark is. In this plane, your sensor. So the focal plane will always remain parallel to this. You can go as far away from the camera as possible, or as much as you want to go far away from the camera, but the focal plane will remain parallel to this plane of the sensor. Does it make sense?
You'll have to explain it a bit, I guess.
Okay, so let me say, all right, let's say this book is the plane, this book, this one side of it, this is a plane, okay, and I want to shoot this side of it, and now I am pointing the camera to the side,
the book.
To the book, okay. So the book's plane, everything on this book plane, I want all the text to be in focus. Now because if I keep the book parallel to the sensor plane of the camera, all the text will be in focus.
Right.
Does it make sense? So all the objects in the focal plane will remain in focus because that is in one plane. Okay. Now this plane is two-dimensional.
Parallel to the sensor, all the objects that are placed in line parallel to the sensor, they can be focused at one point of time. If the objects are I mean, if there is one object that's ahead of another or it's behind the another, that we can actually.
Yeah. Let me come to that. You're right. So right now, for understanding purpose, the thickness of this plane is like thickness of this paper. Like you just take one page, okay? This one page. Its thickness is almost negligible, right?
Right.
There's no thickness. It's only single. So this is a plane, two-dimensional plane, and it does not have any thickness. Okay. Now, depth of field, what depth of field means is this object, this text is in focus, but how much thickness of this plane will remain in focus? That's depth of field. Okay. So an object which is here is in focus, but then up to how much thickness, up to how much depth things will remain in focus, that's depth of field. Okay. So if you look at this, let's say you are pointing the camera here, and then you're trying to capture this text, and you want all this plane in focus, all the objects in this plane in focus. This edge will represent the depth, up to what depth, right? Now, keep remembering, this is the plane which is facing the camera, and this side is representing the thickness, the depth of the plane. But this is depth of field. This is, in camera language, this thickness is called depth of field. That's what it is. Now let me come to the fact that how aperture affects this depth of field. If you increase the f number, which means your aperture is very small, the depth of field will be very wide. So things which are here will be in focus, things which are here will be in focus, here will be in focus, here will be in focus, infinitely. Everything behind this point will be in focus. And let's say this point is at minimum focusing distance of the lens. Everything behind this will be in focus if f-stop is big number, or f number is big number, like f18, f8, f12, f16, f18. If f number is at bigger numbers, the focal plane will be quite wide, and objects at different depths will be in focus. If the aperture number is small, which means aperture is wide open, the focal plane will be very thin. So focal plane, instead of being this much, it will only be this much. So objects which are here will be in focus, objects will be here in the focus. But any object which is behind this will be out of focus, it will be blurred. And obviously any object which are ahead of this part will always be out of focus, because this is the minimum focusing distance. Make sense?
I guess there was some network issue. If you can repeat it again.
Oh, okay. So if you reduce the f number, which means the aperture of the lens is wide open, the depth of field will be very small. So earlier we saw the depth of field was this much, this, and like goes up to infinite, but at smaller f numbers, which means wider apertures, the depth of field becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So for example, f2.0, the depth of field will be only this much. Yep. Or f1.8, it will be further only this much. So it will keep reducing, what does it mean? An object which is here at minimum focusing distance will be in focus. An object which is here will also be in focus, because this is the depth of field. But then any object which is placed behind this, or even further behind than this range, will be out of focus. It will be blurred out. But any object which is kept before this, like this distance between the camera and this minimum focusing distance, will always be out of focus, because this is out of the range that your lens can focus. Okay?
Yep.
Make sense? All right.
Yep.
So this is the concept of depth of field, and how changing the aperture affects the depth of field. Now this blur that happens when the depth of field is very narrow, the background objects become blurred, and this blur is called bokeh. Bokeh is nothing but a Japanese word that means blur. So it's nothing magical, because many people chase after bokeh. I'm not getting good bokeh, I don't know what to do. But bokeh just means blur, and it's a Japanese for English word blur. So I will spend a little bit time on bokeh, what it is. Bokeh is basically out of focus area, it's blurred area. And there are three things that control it. Aperture definitely controls it, but then full frame cameras have better bokeh, better out of focus area than the crop sensor cameras. Longer focal lengths will have better bokeh than the shorter focal lengths, and closer the subject is to the minimum focusing distance of the lens, the better will be the bokeh. So those are the three things that affect bokeh. All right, let's move on to the shutter speed. We are at 525, and I'll try to cover shutter speed very quickly, and this is going well. And I hope you guys are learning everything which I'm telling. If not, you can watch this session afterwards again.
Yeah, it will be there.
And you can keep your questions ready after the session ends. All right. So shutter speed is speed of something. As the name sounds, is the speed of something. And what is the speed of? So shutter is like a curtain like parda in Hindi. Between the lens and the sensor is a curtain, and as you take a picture, it moves out for sensor to record the image, and then as the picture is taken, the curtain moves back. So that's basically what happens. That's the shutter. This is the shutter, and how fast it moves is the shutter speed. Okay, I'll tell you again with an example. So let's say this whole area is the sensor of the camera, okay? And okay, I need something that big that covers it equally. Okay, let's say this is the sensor of the camera, and this is the shutter. So it covers it all the time. At default mode, it's covering. The shutter is covering the sensor. As soon as you press the shutter button to click the image, the shutter moves out of the way, and when it's finished recording the image, the shutter moves back up. Okay? Now the speed at which the shutter moves away and back in its position is the speed of the shutter, or shutter speed. So your camera sensor has pixels in it, because that's what camera manufacturers advertise: megapixel, these many megapixels, 20 megapixels, 60 megapixels. That's the number of pixels on the sensor. So each pixel records light, and that represents one pixel in your image. Think of each pixel as a bucket, like the bucket in which you fill water. Think of it like a bucket, and each pixel, like a bucket, tries to collect light. Okay? Now, as a bucket, if you put it under the tap, it takes certain time to fill up. And it depends on how good the flow from the tap is. If the flow is good, there's a lot of water, then the bucket will fill quickly. If there's less flow, the flow from the tap is not good, it will take longer time for the bucket to fill up. So it's like it tries to collect light. Each pixel tries to collect light, just like how a bucket gets filled with water. That's what it does. So as long as the shutter is open, the pixels are allowed to collect light, like a bucket fill up with water. So each pixel is trying to collect the light, and as soon as it's done, it has collected enough light, the shutter closes back in. Okay? All right. So now, as this is the third parameter that controls the exposure, that controls how much light is being recorded by your camera sensor. Now, if there's less light, you want your shutter to stay open for longer time, so that your pixels are able to record sufficient light. Okay? If there's too much light, then you want your shutter to open and close very fast, because there's too much light. You only want the sufficient light to be recorded by the camera sensor. If the light is too much in the surrounding, you open the shutter for longer duration, then all the image will be whitewashed. The complete image will be white because there's too much light. All the pixels will be filled with light very quickly, and then it will overflow, which means all the details will be lost. So based on how much light is present in the surrounding, you decide for how long you want to keep the shutter open. Okay? So that's basically how you operate shutter speed. to control the amount of light that goes into the camera. Now, shutter speed also has some side effects, like there were other side effects of aperture and ISO. Yeah. So this is not very complicated. Side effects of shutter speed is very straightforward because it's very obvious and intuitive to understand. So if the shutter stays open for longer duration, that means if an object is in motion, the motion will be blurred. There will be a motion blur. Okay? So when can you keep your shutter open for longer duration? You will have to do it when there's less light, that's for sure. But when is it desirable? It's desirable and acceptable if you're shooting landscape because everything is still. Or if you want to capture motion as a motion blur, like traffic light trails, or you are capturing waterfall and you want to capture the motion of the water, makes it look really smooth. So those are some of the times when you use a slow shutter speed so that the motion blur is recorded. Or you use it in the evening times. If you're shooting landscape at an evening time, everything is still, you can use slow shutter speed and everything will be sharp and focused because nothing is moving. On the other hand, you try to use a very fast shutter speed, very quick shutter speed, if you want to freeze the motion. If something is moving very fast and you want to freeze it, you want to capture the action really frozen in time, then you use a very fast shutter speed. It's, for example, if somebody is jumping or there's a sports shot, where if you're shooting sports like wrestling match or maybe swimming or somebody diving and you want to capture them mid-air or some sort of action you are shooting, then you want to use fast shutter speed. Now,
like wildlife photography, if a cheetah is running behind some prey, then you would want to capture the animal running.
yeah,
So then you
exactly. That's a very good example. So that's how you will use shutter speed to capture either fast action frozen in time or motion blur, or when there's low light and nothing is moving, everything is still. So that's how you will decide whether to use fast shutter speed or slow shutter speed. Okay, so that's a creative use of it, but then there's a mandatory use of it when you want more light or less light depending on the scenario in which you are shooting. Now, so that's it. That brings us to the end of the session, and I would hand it over to you, Pankaj. Thank you for this session and this opportunity. We can take questions that people may have.
sure. Let me just see if we have questions. Guys, you can please put up your question. So there was question, someone asked to explain shutter speed, that you have already done. There was one before that. Just a sec. So there is one, how do we resolve overexposure?
Do you think we have answered this?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we have already answered this question?
Okay, probably the person is asking from editing point of view. Is if that's so, we will be covering it in next sessions. If you are asking from shooting point of view, at the time of shooting, yeah, Ashish has already answered it. So you can actually, depending upon the situation, you can reduce your ISO, you can increase your shutter speed, and you can play around with the exposure triangle and see that lesser light falls on your sensor.
One thing I can add is metering is an important aspect to control exposure, to understand like how much light is there.
Metering
will be covering, in the session, in one of the few sessions, next session that is I think it may be just the next session. I have not checked the schedule, and
So
it will be
there is
covered.
another. What should be the shutter speed while capturing the portrait?
Depends on what kind of portrait you're trying to capture. There are multiple kinds of portraits. There's some, if you're shooting a dancer, you may want to capture the motion. If you want to freeze the motion, if you're shooting a model, then you can pretty much direct the model like where to stay still, not move. You can use additional lights. So as such, there's no shutter speed to shoot portraits, like as a guiding principle. But there's one guiding principle that your shutter speed should be 1 by, like inverse of whatever your focal length is. So for example, this is an 85 mm lens, and if I'm shooting with this handheld, not on a tripod, I'm shooting with this on handheld, then I would want to maintain shutter speed less than, more faster than 1 by 85. Okay?
So
Or
that
if
we
I'm
there is
shooting,
no motion blur.
if I'm shooting with this lens, this is 50 mm, I need to have at least 1 by 50 seconds of shutter speed. Now this controls, this helps with the handshake or the
Yep.
shake of the camera. It doesn't help you with the motion of the subject.
Yep.
Okay, that you need to understand. And this is only a guiding principle, and it originated when there was no stabilization built into the lenses or in the camera. But nowadays you have stabilization, so you can shoot, if it's a stabilized lens, at 1 by let's say 20 seconds with an 85 mm handheld, and you'll be fine with that. So as such, I don't see any shutter speed, recommended shutter speed for portraits. That's totally up to you, and depending on the equipment and the situation that you're in.
Yeah, actually, it would depend a lot upon whether it's bright sunlight day or you're doing it in evening, what kind of color combination you're looking for. But yeah, I haven't encountered too many cases wherein people use very long exposures in case of portraits. Uh, Very long exposures are normally used in star photography, night photography, but portraits, it's normally freezing the movement that I have seen. So I haven't seen any short like 20-second exposure, 20-second shutter speed, or 10-second shutter speed. Rarely people do 8.
So I would also like to add a little bit to that. So as a creative photographer, as somebody who wants to create a unique image, your job is to do something that is unusual, something that is not
Yeah.
usually done.
Yeah.
So in this, I would really leave it up to you to decide, like, how do you want to make an unusual photograph? Like, if you want to take some really different kind of portrait, then you will have to go, off the beaten path. You have to start doing what nobody else is doing instead of trying to do what everybody else is doing.
Yep.
So that's again like what we talked in the previous session, that creativity is really important, and you need to try to focus on creating unique images and not focus on I want to click like what everybody else is doing, because then there are millions of other photographers who are clicking portraits at like recommended shutter speeds. Like, what's different about you?
Yep. For sure. Is there any other question, guys, that you have? I guess. Let's just wait for another minute if someone wants to put in a question.
Sure. In the meantime, if you have some question, you can ask.
So Ashish, there are variations when we talk about if the object is moving, then then what should be the shutter speed? I mean, or I'll just reframe it. For each of these three components, exposure triangle, when we talk about, how do we decide which one to change depending upon the situation. If the light is low, you can you can change any one of the three, and increase the amount of light that is falling on the sensor. So what should be the criteria to decide which one should I change, which one should I keep stationary? Um, because normally what we do is we, in manual settings also, there is this either we play around mostly with shutter speed, or we play around mostly with ISO or aperture. Everyone has got a favorite out of the three. Um,
Mm.
but what should be the criteria to decide which one to alter?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I think most photographers face this dilemma, like which one should I change? Because sometimes there seems to be a tie, like none of the settings can be changed based on the lighting condition, and
Yeah.
I want to shoot this, what to do? Now, there's a learning curve with this using the ISO trying ISO and aperture and shutter speed. There's a learning curve, and it all depends on your vision, and then there's limitation of the equipment. I mentioned some of the examples, so let me just go ahead and mention those examples. If there's a low light and fast moving subject, then it's a contradictory situation. So low light wants you to use a slower shutter speed, but the subject is fast moving, which makes you use faster shutter speed. So it's
Yeah.
contradicting requirement, and then you are kind of like in a tie, like what to do. And this is the situation. These are the kind of situations which are driving innovation at the companies to make cameras that can shoot acceptable images at higher ISOs. Because if that is the situation, the only option you're left with is to increase the ISO.
Yeah.
Because you can't reduce the shutter speed. If you reduce the shutter speed, you cannot freeze the moving subject, right?
Absolutely.
And aperture has a limit. You can get up to aperture 1.4 in really expensive lenses, but those are really expensive lenses we are talking about. And even after 1.4, there's nothing you can do. And at 1.4, your focal length is so thin that barely anything will be in focus. If there's a moving person, only the eye will be in focus, everything else will be out of focus. So shooting at that wide apertures is also not recommended in most normal conditions. So aperture has its own limit because you can only go up to a certain extent. There are two kinds of limit. One is depth of field, another is physical limitation of the lens. It cannot go beyond 1.4 or 1.8 or whatever is the limit of your lens. So in that case, the only option you'll be left with is increasing the ISO. Another example is you want to capture motion blur, but it's broad daylight.
Yeah.
Okay, it's let's say it's
That's
a
a
broad
problem.
daylight market scene, and then
Yeah.
people are moving very fast, and you want to capture that motion blur. So you'll have to use a slower shutter speed. There's no roundabout. You'll have to use slow shutter speed. There's no other option. But it's broad daylight. In broad daylight, because there's too much light, you'll have to use a smaller aperture. Okay, a smaller aperture. Sorry. In broad daylight, that will require you to use faster shutter speed. But because you want to capture motion blur, you'll have to use slower shutter speed, right? So there again, you're in the fix. So again, aperture has its limitation. Your camera can go minimum up to f22 or maybe f24 or f30, but it has a physical limitation at what f-stop it can go to. After that, you don't have any other choice. So in this kind of situation, you'll have to depend on a prop. ND filters are used for that to reduce the amount of light that's going into the camera. But then we get into a territory which is not in the scope of this session. Well,
Yeah.
quickly, I forgot to mention one thing about aperture. There are two more side effects of aperture which I forgot to mention. At higher f-stops, like f-stop more than f16, there's diffraction phenomena which affects your sharpness of the image. It's very like minute difference that happens. It's physics, there's nothing can be done about it. But it's very minuscule, very smaller impact, but it's there. So after F16, beyond F16, like F18, F20, F22, the sharpness will reduce in your pictures because of diffraction. And another creative use of high F numbers, which means a smaller apertures, is you can create a star burst. So if you make your aperture really, really small, like F22, F24, and then you point your camera towards the sun, you will get this star burst, like sun rays coming in the burst form, and that looks very beautiful and often used in landscape photography. So there you go. That was it.
Okay, so please suggest investing in mirrorless or full frame. What do you suggest, sir? So we'll be covering the cameras in one of the later sessions. I guess it's tomorrow. So I will put the announcement on my Insta stories immediately after this session. And can I have a recorded session by any chance as I joined late? Yeah, so this session would be on my profile for next 24 hours. So you can go through it after that. If you have any question related to the exposure triangle, you can drop a message to me or send a DM to Ashish. We can take the questions in next session. That's tomorrow, 5 o'clock. And we will be covering a new topic about photography in that session. There are 5 more sessions that are planned. One is tomorrow, then Sunday we won't be doing any session, and then Monday to Thursday. So in totality, it would be 7 sessions in days. So yeah, thank you so much, Ashish. Thanks for the insights. We'll see if we get some questions. I'll note it down and we cover it in next session. Thank you so much, guys, for joining in. I hope you are having a good time learning bit by bit, and keep practicing, keep reading, so that when you come for the next session, either you have questions or you have better insights about what's going on. So when Ashish covers a particular topic in a day, go back and do some research about it so that you keep getting what exactly that is. So thanks, guys. Thanks for joining in. To someone has commented, Travel My Way says, thanks, Ashish. Very informative session. Thank you so much from all on behalf of all the viewers and myself. Thanks. Have a good day, guys.
Thank you, Pankaj, and thank you everybody for joining. Please join into our next sessions, and hope you guys enjoyed it. If you can message me, DM me what you liked about the session, what you did not like. If there's any improvement that you can suggest, I'll be thankful. Have a good day, guys. See you tomorrow.
Thanks. Bye bye.